Hi there, I'm Adam Leventhal. Welcome to the Athletic FC. We are reviewing what we've learnt from the opening 7 game weeks of the season. I am here with Tim Spiers. How are you, Tim?
Hello there, how are you? You all right?
I'm very well. It's good to be here once again with you and with John Mackenzie. Are you enjoying this international break so far? Do you decompress a little bit?
Oh yeah, plenty of decompression going on right now. Catch up on some of the games that I probably should have watched but haven't, and enjoy a little bit of a easier pace to life.
You catch up on games?
What have you been watching?
What have you been watching?
Usually clubs. I'll go through if there's a team I feel as though I've not caught enough of their games, I'll go back and watch a few.
Like which ones?
Well, I've rewatched a lot of Arsenal games in the last week. I did an Arsenal podcast a few days ago. Mm-hmm. We did a Chelsea show today, so I watched most of their games back that I hadn't watched yet. I watched some Wolves, wish I hadn't, but did. And I'm sure there's other things that I'll catch up on.
Yeah, imagine having to watch Wolves.
Yeah, I'm not going to be doing that anymore.
I hear there's some other teams in the vicinity that you could pivot to if you wanted to.
In the local area?
Yeah, there's plenty of teams around there.
We are going to be talking about every single team in the Premier League on this podcast. That is our guarantee to you. Okay, we are going to begin by going through the top 5, and we're going to start with the league leaders, Liverpool. Now, you predicted, John, that they were going to be doing very well, but you did caveat that by saying that they have had an easy start to the season. Do you think that they're going to be able to sustain this start that they've had?
Yeah, they had the statistically easiest start, I think, out of any of the teams over a certain period. I can't remember if it was 5 or 10 games.
No easy games in the Premier League.
Well, yeah, that is true. And, you know, they had gone from losing a dynastic coach to bringing in a new coach, so it wasn't as if, you know, it was just going to be plain sailing for them. So they've done very well, I think, so far. They've seemed to have picked up on what Arne Slot wants them to do, and they've given themselves a really nice base from which to start operating, because I think in these scenarios, like, two things happen, right? One is that you get better at doing what your manager wants you to do, so in theory you improve, but the problem is that other teams get better at finding your weaknesses and finding ways of stopping you. So I guess the question for Liverpool going forward is going to be how do those two sort of competing lines of pressure come up against each other? Are Liverpool going to do better than other teams do against them, or will we see them maybe slow down a little bit going forwards?
What top tinkers has he done already then?
Well, I'd say that there's lots of similarities between what he was doing and Jurgen Klopp. I would say that he's a little bit more in the Roberto De Zerbi school. So where someone like Jurgen Klopp, I think, towards the end, he was quite direct attacking and exciting, almost back to where he began in the Premier League. But during his time in the Premier League, I'd say he moved a little bit more into that Guardiola school of having to control games, force opponents back. Whereas I think with Arne Slot, they flip the logic on the head and you say, rather than squeezing opponents back, you sort of bait them to come forward and press you. That creates space in behind. When you're a team like Liverpool, you have lots of players who are going to really thrive in that kind of space. So we've seen really good showings from players like Luis Diaz and Mohamed Salah as well, because of the way that they are generating space and attacking it. So the big question is whether or not teams are going to be as willing to allow them that space going forward. What happens when they start maybe sitting a little bit deeper and saying, no, you come to us because we know if we go up to you, you're gonna hit us really hard in transition.
Tim, is this an amazing achievement, or are we forgetting the fact that maybe Liverpool needed just something new, an injection of something new?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, the old adage is that if you don't sign players in a transfer window, then you're sort of staying still / going backwards because all the teams around you are going to improve. Obviously, their different approach has been with the head coach, but it's easy to forget, Adam, that with 8 games to go at the end of last season, they were top of the Premier League, and they only lost 4 games all season, one of which was Arsenal away, one of which was 9 men at Spurs. So they had a very, very, very good team. I think one thing that maybe has changed is they might be slightly less emotional this year, which was a bit of a theme last year. If you remember, we spoke week after week about how they were going behind in games, but I think they earned 28 points from losing positions last season, which was the most in the league. They had this constant churn of going behind and then relying on, you know, emotion and whatever, and the cop to sort of drag them through to these victories. So, but I don't recall an example of a manager taking over and not signing any players. I know they signed Chiesa, and to have this success is impressive, especially with not much time after the Euros, you know, in terms of training. But they have had the easiest start. I'm telling myself this from a Wolves point of view constantly, that they've had the most difficult start, and that is a caveat, and they're bottom of the league, and Liverpool have had the easy start and they're top of the league. But the numbers are very impressive. They've had an incredible defensive record so far, in terms of XG and in terms of goals against, and there's nothing much you can say negatively about anything that they've done so far.
Let's move on to second, Manchester City and Arsenal in third. The only two teams, unlike Liverpool, who lost against Nottingham Forest this season, to be unbeaten. I suppose that shouldn't come as much of a surprise that they are both unbeaten. They had that great game at the Etihad 2-2. Was that your pick of the season so far, John, in terms of a sort of end-to-end crazy game with lots of extra elements thrown in?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was less end-to-end after the red card occurred and it became...
That's true, yeah. It wasn't end-to-end, was it, really? It was end...
It was
one
end.
Yeah.
One
end.
End to the same end,
yeah.
I mean, it was a fun game. It was obviously City picked up the early goal there, and it looked like they could maybe ease their way through that fixture. But then a number of things happened. Rodri got injured, obviously with that knee injury, which is going to keep him out for the rest of the season. Arsenal managed to do what they do. They scored a set piece goal, and they sort of scored quite a nice. Am I allowed to say worldie?
Yeah, worldie's fine.
Worldie's okay.
Yeah,
okay. Calafiori got that really nice goal. But yeah, it set it up for a really interesting finale, which was Arsenal 2-1 up with a player down once Trossard was sent off, and City's dominating the possession. I think, in the end, Arsenal had, I think, 30% possession. Was it less than that? It was very, very small amount, and eventually they got the goal through John Stones. So it was a sort of fascinating game, but maybe not as representative of some of the games that we've seen between those two teams so far. But yeah, they're still the two teams to beat, I think, this time around, even with Liverpool on the top of the table. And I think what's so interesting about them is the two very different approaches to playing football. And I think a lot of people thought of Arteta as being an acolyte of Pep Guardiola, but what we've seen is him moving away, I think, from some of those principles that Guardiola uses. I think both of them quite risk averse, but risk averse in very different ways. Pep Guardiola risk averse with the ball, and I think Arteta happy to be very defensive without it, which is unlike what you might expect from a disciple of Pep Guardiola. So it sets up a really nice sort of, almost like a nice balance of different play styles at the top of the table in that title challenge to really give it a nice edge, I think.
Tim, obviously one of the main subplots is, at the moment, Arsenal missing Odegaard, Rodri out for Manchester City, and Rodri's going to be out for the rest of the season. So you would look at that and say, well, Odegaard will come back and Arsenal will have their main man back. So technically, they're favourites to go all the way and win the title, if you think about the key element of those two players in those two respective squads.
Yeah, maybe. I think Rodri's miss is obviously going to be sizable. I know John has spoken before about how they're better equipped to cope without him, but the evidence isn't great from the first two games that they've been without him. Newcastle away, Newcastle really pinned them back for long spells of that game and forced them into a lot of mistakes. And the Fulham game, I mean, they got away with one there, really. Fulham's XG numbers were comfortably higher than Man City's, and if Adama Traore could shoot, which I know from watching him for many years that he can't, then yeah, Fulham would have won that game. And then we'd all be saying, oh, City's title hopes in tatters. It's probably what you'd have said. So, yeah, no, there's definitely a concern over Man City's defence. They haven't kept a clean sheet in the league since the opening day of the season. They've conceded 8 goals in 7, which is the same as Man United, and we're all talking about Man United's disastrous defence. So I think it's fair to point that out. They certainly lacked control against Newcastle. They certainly lacked control against Fulham. And it's not often that we say Man City or that they got away with one there, It's not often they beat a team at home and they got away with one there. They were lucky to win that. It's very, very rare you can say that. Whether this is all directly related to Rodri's absence, I guess we'll tell over time. But the early evidence suggests that, yeah, they're certainly lacking his control in midfield.
Arsenal are better than they were last season, aren't they, John?
Ooh, that's a question. Arsenal are different from how they were last season. I think it's really hard to analyse Arsenal this season because you can caveat almost every game that they've had so far, because there's been 2 where they've gone down to 10 men. They've lost Erdegaard in certain after 3 games, I think it was. Yes, some of the games that they've played, they've had to play in the way that they've played because of those external factors. Mikel Merino injured as well, who was expected to come in, and they've not really been able to replace either Erdegaard or Merino in the way that they would have wanted to. Pushing Declan Rice forward and then playing Thomas Partey or Jorginho variably. So it's really, really tough to determine where they're at. I mean, in terms of the numbers, they're worse this season because they're putting up mid-table numbers, but that's because of the caveats that we've talked about. So I'm kind of interested to see what happens when we sort of get a clean slate with Arsenal and they have all those players back fit and we can have a much better sense of what it was that Mikel Arteta intended the team to look like after they made those changes in the transfer window. But I think what I have been impressed with about Arsenal has been their ability to come through those situations where things haven't gone their way and put up the points, right? Hugely impressive to hold out against City for that whole half where they barely left their own half. Hugely impressive, I think, to hold on to the result that they had in the Brighton fixture as well, where they went down to 10 men. And then, the games against, for example, the Spurs game, where they were very, very defensively conservative, I would say, in that game, and they came out with the win there. So in a lot of these games, they've been doing enough to put themselves there and thereabouts with respect to the top of the table, right? That's all you can do in these situations. And now they're getting to a situation where there are going to be more of those players available. Mikel Merino has been playing. Sounds like Martin Ødegaard is training again. So I think that Arsenal fans should be pretty positive about the season they've had so far, despite the fact that there will be those disappointments with injuries and refereeing decisions.
And spicy next 4 games, within them Liverpool, Newcastle and Chelsea for Arsenal. So they will receive those sturdy tests as well. Just behind Manchester City and Arsenal sit Chelsea and Aston Villa on 14 points, both with 4 wins, 2 draws and 1 defeat. Tim, I wanted to come to you on Chelsea, please, because at the beginning of the season you were basically saying they're a mess. Yes. They continue to be a mess, and I don't see how they're ever going to not be a mess. I'm paraphrasing basically what you were saying.
Yeah, I said mess a lot. Basically.
What do you say about them now and the job that Enzo Maresca is doing and has the potential to do for the rest of the season?
Yeah, I think he sort of unlocked them in certain attacking areas. The slight difference in Cole Palmer's position in the season made a big difference. That they're flawed. And they're on a good run at the moment, but they're flawed. That Brighton game was bonkers, when they were playing out from the back and Sanchez was giving them a couple of goals.
But was that Brighton bringing bonkers to a game as they have done recently, or was that Chelsea being sort of open to being bonkers?
Ooh. Say that again.
Well, no, Brighton bring bonkers at the moment, don't they?
Sure. Yeah.
Was that Brighton being in the game? Come on, it's not much of a leap of understanding of what I'm saying. Was that more down to it being a game against Brighton, or was that Chelsea?
I mean, they were just doing some pretty standard, dodgy playing out from the back, and gave them a couple of goals via Sanchez. I don't think that was Brighton.
So that's individual errors rather than structural difficulties.
It's interesting that Maresca said after that game, look, I absolve the keeper of any blame. Like this is what we're going. It's a bit of a theme of the season actually, playing out from the back. We're talking about reviewing what we've seen so far. There's a number of teams that are not doing it very well, and you just persist in doing it over and over again.
But on that point, should fans, when they're seeing it, go, just put your foot through it, just get rid of it? Or should we stick to our principles?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think if you look at some of the teams at the top of the table, they're much less concerned to do the patient build-up stuff than they were. So, for example, Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool, I think that they're much more open to going direct than they were in previous seasons. Man City is still in. There's a graph that Opta like to put out, which is the amount of passes that you have in a sequence and how quick you move the ball down the field. And City are always in the slow, lots of passes, section of that. The other end of the table, you have teams like Forest or Bournemouth who are going to try and get the ball forward as quickly as possible. They're not too bothered about build-up. And a lot of the teams that were challenging or trying to get into the title challenge were thinking, well, the way we catch up with City is we do what City do, right? We do a lot of patient build-up and we slowly work our way down the field and break down the opponent. Whereas I think what we're starting to see now is a lot of those teams aren't that bothered to actually have like super patient build up where they move the ball down the field. I think Chelsea fit into that category because they've got the players like when you've got Sancho, you play Pedro Neto, you can play Madueke, you can play Nicholas Jackson, you can play Cole Palmer. If you get those players running into space, it's the same thing we were talking about with Liverpool before. These players are like they're going to absolutely finish you off if they have that amount of space to run into. So I think there's a lot of teams now trying to work out how to create those kind of environments rather than doing the City thing of sort of patient build-up. Because the issue is, as we've said with City, is that you leave lots of space behind you to defend, and they're finding it harder and harder to defend those big spaces. So yeah, I think what's fascinating is that a lot of the teams, I mean, I know we're talking about Chelsea, but like the teams who are trying to do the slow and patient build-up, I mean, the team closest to Man City now stylistically is Southampton when it comes to build up, and that's the big prompt of that question, right? Should they be trying to play in this way if it's not really giving them any upside? It seems like the teams are actually trying to be like City now, are the teams in a relegation battle rather than the teams who are actually trying to get into the Champions League spots.
Yeah, I mean, you said about Mikel Arteta not being a Pep acolyte or a Pepperlite, as I would say. Let's move on to Aston Villa. Obviously, we focused quite a lot on them ahead of the game against Manchester United. So we don't need to spend too much time on Aston Villa. And it was interesting in that game, incidentally, that you said Manchester United needed to go to Aston Villa and just do a sort of back to basics Sean
and
Dyche
I said they wouldn't do it.
Tuck in. They wouldn't do it, but they did. Yeah.
And it worked.
They did.
Maybe he listened to the podcast.
Exactly. I reckon he did. Where do we sort of sit on where Aston Villa, or what Aston Villa have achieved so far this season and how they've been doing it? Because obviously the subplot has been John Duran coming in, doing amazing things. But they have so far balanced out European pressure with an uplift in the Champions League, and they're sitting very, very comfortably in fifth as well. So Unai Emery has gone up in your estimation even more?
Although I think the true test probably comes in October, November.
Right, so they haven't hit it yet.
No, they've only had the 2 Champions League games so far, and we did see. I've never been to a Lord Mayor's show. I'm assuming. Oh, you might have done. I don't think John has. You might have done.
What's a Lord Mayor's show?
Exactly, but what comes after that, as they say, is Villa's performance against Man United. In terms of they were very, very flat. And the crowd was really flat as well. It was all very well. The Bayern game was great, wasn't it? A couple of days ago.
But they're just playing a mid-table side. It's just any old game, isn't it?
Are you trying to take the heat off me in the comments section? I appreciate that. He's obviously doing a fantastic job, and Duran is the main sort of subplot of what they've been doing.
He
so
said
far.
it twice.
That
was fantastic. That was very good. You said it naturally twice. Well done.
Yeah, it was.
Was it deliberate?
No, it wasn't.
Oh, okay.
What he's been doing in terms of in terms of how they're combining the strikers with Watkins, Tyrant defenders, and then Duran coming on and scoring a goal. It's interesting to see how long that's going to last, because obviously his future's been up in the air for a while. It's amazing how he nearly left for West Ham in the summer, and the complete turnaround now to being one of the Premier League's sort of foremost strikers. New contracts, undoubtedly he's got a decent pay rise. I don't think he's going to be there too long, personally. I mean, he's talking about joining West Ham in the summer. He was talking about joining Bayern Munich last week. I think you see his quote as saying, I'd love to play for them one day. But in terms of how he combines him and Watkins this season, it will be interesting, because if Watkins doesn't produce the goods in front of goal, then you've got a guy whose goals per minute ratio is right up there with Haaland in terms of being the best in the league this season. So when does that flip? When does he say Duran's his primary starter instead of Watkins? But at the moment, he's got the balance just right. It's working perfectly.
So down the other end of the table, there are 4 teams, and they're yet to win a game. Wolves, Southampton, Crystal Palace and Ipswich. 2 of those sides newly promoted. So you would expect them to have difficulty adapting to the Premier League, perhaps, in Southampton and Ipswich Town. Now, we mentioned that Liverpool have had a relatively easy run of games, and they've made a strong start. Wolves, on the other hand, have had some difficult games that they've had to face in there. The likes of Arsenal, Chelsea Liverpool, Aston Villa as well. And they also do have to now face Manchester City and Brighton in their next 2 games. Now, Tim, you've made a big old thing about Wolves having a tough run of fixtures. How many seasons have Wolves been in the Premier League?
I'm not going to answer that.
How many seasons? I'll just talk over you. How many seasons have Wolves been in the Premier
If you
League?
want to know, look it up.
Okay, right. You wait there.
All right.
Wait. Wolves seasons.
It's been 6 years.
6 years in the Premier League. Okay, you have surely by now adapted to the difficulty of games in the Premier League. Across the course of 7 games, you've also faced the likes of Nottingham Forest, Newcastle, and Brentford. You've got 1 point. What is happening, and what's your excuse?
Can I make a request that you attend Gary O'Neill's next press conference and ask him just that question in that manner as well?
Yeah, and see how it goes down. Well, no, but at the end of the day, I think that those are fair points. Tell me why, and for people looking in, what has been the massive underperformance from Wolves this season? If you compare it to how he excelled in difficult circumstances at the beginning of last season. So what's the big drop-off? Just the lack of players, lack of investment? What is it?
Yeah, I won't bleat on about the fixture list. And to be fair, I haven't really. I think it's always worth mentioning as to why people look at the table, say Wolves are bottom. Well, part of the reason is that they've had these and these games, which you're less likely to get points from. Disappointingly, Gary O'Neill has sort of mentioned it a little bit as well in his press conferences and said, look, we're second favourites in every game we've played this season before the Brentford one. And that's not an attitude that sits well with me from a manager because, we, as Wolves fans, we're used to Nuno from a few years ago, taking on and beating all of these teams. In terms of what's going on right now, there are bigger issues at play in terms of the club is drifting a bit and lack of investment from the owners. They've made quite a lot of money in the last 2 years, and that hasn't been reinvested in the team. I think in terms of the ambitions of the club have been seriously scaled down. And yeah, if you're going to scale down your ambitions and only be a club that looks to stay up, once in a while you will get sucked into this and you will hit the drop. And there are loads of clubs in the Championship who that happened to after 3, 4, 5, 6 years in the Premier League. It'll happen eventually, But in terms of what's wrong with the team for the here and now, they've switched from a back 5 to a back 4. If you're going to do that, you need 2 good centre halves. At the same time,
but have they just simply left a defender on the sidelines, or have they replaced? Are they still using 11 players?
Still going for the 11 players.
Okay,
tactic.
cool. I just wanted to check because it is showing.
No,
it is showing in their
Well, they've gone
performance.
for a sort of a more robust 3-man midfield. Lamina, João Gomez, and Andre to sort of try and negate that. But the problem is, you're just sticking a cross in the box, and the defenders aren't jumping for that cross. I don't know if you watched the Brentford game as part of your extra research, but Wolves gave away about 10 free headers in that match. It was criminal. So yeah, basically they sold Max Kilman for 40 million, and they did not replace him in the squad. They thought Yerson Mosquera, Colombian player, a lot of potential, been on loan at Villarreal, would fill that hole. He was doing okay, but now he's out for the season with an ACL. So they've got a huge problem. They haven't even got the numbers really to play 5 at the back anymore. So he's got that wrong. And, they clearly tried to sign centre-halves in the window. They tried to sign Dara O'Shea, who went to Ipswich. Wolves were outbid, which I thought was pretty embarrassing. So, yeah, if you're going to let Kilman and Neto go and not replace either of them, then you're going to struggle. And just finally on Wolves, in terms of the money they spent, they spent 20 million on Andre, when I don't think they necessarily needed to bring in an extra midfielder as a top priority. They also spent 10 million on Sam Johnston, who's made a number of mistakes and is arguably a downgrade on Jose Sarr, who's just sat on the bench doing nothing. So there's a few strange things that are going on there.
Thank you. That's all we've got time
I could go
for.
on for another half an hour, honestly. Sorry.
No, I can imagine. And it is, Wolves fans will be listening to this and thinking, yeah, this is looking very, very dicey. We've scored 9, conceded 21 already, and it's only 7 games into the season. Crystal Palace, their issues, it's similar, isn't it? Losing key players. Michael Elise and Joachim Andersen have left. And Oliver Glasner's, hard work getting us excited for this season. It's just sort of, the bubble has burst a little bit, hasn't it?
We talked a little bit about Palace on the Tifo podcast this week. And my dear colleague Alex Barker was saying, when you lose a player like Michael Elise, it was tempting to sort of recreate him in the aggregate, right? So they brought in Kamada, they brought in Ismail Assar, they brought in Eddie Nketiah.
It's the Gareth Bale approach.
Yeah, right. And he was saying you've just got to accept in those scenarios you're never going to replace Elise like for like. You can only obviously field one player anyway, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're expecting to get the same goal haul from 2 or 3 players, you can only play one of them at a time. So, but he was saying what's really interesting about the way that Palace play is that obviously they use this 3-4-3 shape. They're the only team really to have this season consistently used a back 3. The other team is, I think, Brentford, who switch between a 4 and a 3 depending on the opponent. And so he was saying, well, if you're going to create less with your Elise replacement, it's super important for you to have options in the wing back positions who can pick up the slack and offer a little bit more threat going forward. But Palace, I think that was the only position they didn't really strengthen in this summer. So you've got Daniel Munoz and Tyreek Mitchell, I think, playing. And both of those are players who've traditionally played as fullbacks and not particularly attacking ones. And so he was saying it feels as though Palace should have been a little bit savvier in the window and brought in some more attacking options at wing back so they can flip them around depending on the opponent. And as a result, they've just not looked anywhere near as dangerous as they did last season when they had, surprise, Mikel Elise, who's currently tearing up for Bayern Munich. So yeah, I think they've got the players to avoid relegation, but it does again seem as though like the transfer approach that they took this summer actually hasn't worked out for them, and that's why we're seeing them going from, I think they have the record for the biggest discrepancy in points 7 games in compared to what they did in the last 7 games of the previous season, if that makes sense. They won something like 6 out of 7 games at the end of last season in the final 7 games, and then they've got 3 points, I think, from 3 draws. And that's it for them so far. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how Glasner pulls them out of this. But I think that they've got the players; they should be fine.
Let's talk about the 2 newly promoted sides. Southampton, obviously, we've spoken quite a lot about Russell Martin sticking to his principles at Southampton. You spoke earlier on this week about the Vincent Kompany effect of sticking to a principle and thinking, oh God, it's still not working. You need to change your way.
Worked out for him in the end, though, didn't it?
Well, it did, hook or by crook, but it was a bit odd, wasn't it, to be relegated and then get the Bayern Munich job?
Yeah, but as I was saying on the podcast earlier in the week, I don't think it's great news for fans of struggling Premier League teams that Kompany got the Bayern job, because it sets a precedent that, you know, if Burnley had gone 4-4-2 direct long balls, set pieces and stayed up last season, would he have got the Bayern job? I think it's a really interesting question. And
was he not separate to the team that he was managing? Do you not think that his reputation went before him, and even if he was managing Burnley, they were always looking at him because he was an inspirational leader that could actually be dropped into a better side anyway?
I don't know. I mean, he hadn't pulled up any trees at Anderlecht either. I know we're going a bit off topic here, but I'm not sure Bayern would. You maybe give Bayern a bit more credit than that? Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, I don't know. So anyway, let's not get sidetracked by Vincent Kompany.
No, but I think, there's a wider point in that. Are managers playing for themselves rather than necessarily doing the absolute best thing to keep this team in the league?
Well, there were some encouraging signs from Southampton against Arsenal. Is that fair to say? I know they still lost, but they scored, were maybe a bit more competitive. It wasn't a repeat of the Bournemouth performance, was it?
Yeah, this is the tricky thing with the sort of style question, is like what do you expect Russell Martin to do? There seems to be this sort of like holier than thou attitude, which is like, as a bottom, promoted team, you should be sitting deep and 4-4-2 in it and like trying to hit on the break and just accepting your fate. And I think, maybe if Southampton do that, they're in exactly the same position, right? The assumption is always, if you did the other thing, things would be much better off for you. I think a good example of maybe why that doesn't always work is like Leeds United under Marcelo Bielsa, right? Where, yes, Leeds were getting turned over by some of the bigger teams because of the way that they played, but they were also way more competitive against the teams that they needed to beat to stay up in the first place. So I think it's always a tricky one to talk about. There'll be some games, I think, where Southampton will feel we got the benefit of our play style in that game, rather than had we sat deep and just accepted. And that's the tricky thing, right? Is that it's always hard to be a team who largely like dominate in the Championship to then have to go in as underdogs in the Premier League. So I don't know. I'm always a little bit more agnostic on these things. I think a manager should coach the team as the best that they can. I also feel that on your point about managers being typecast a little bit. So Kompany, if he does, as you say, if he goes to Burnley and does 4-4-2, hit him long and rely on set pieces, he's not getting the Bayern job. He'll probably just end up getting the next relegation candidate in the Premier League. When their manager goes, he'll be like, oh well, we've seen that he can manage in this way to sort of fight fires and stuff, and then before you know it, you're stuck at the bottom of the Premier League for your whole career. So I have a level of sympathy as well for him being like, no, I'm gonna try and coach the best football that I can for this team. And I'm sure he doesn't think of it as starkly as we're going to go down if we play this way, but I might get a good job. But I don't know what else coaches are supposed to do in that scenario.
Well, especially if you've been hired with that remit in mind. Jacob Tanswell did a piece recently kind of saying, look, it would have been Martin or Maresca were apparently the two that they looked at when hiring him. They wanted, an antidote to what Hasenhüttl had done. So if the owner's hiring you to do that job and play in that specific way, then maybe you can't just say, right, well, we're going to go direct and long ball. Maybe if there are instructions from above, you look at the Spurs case with Postecoglou. He wasn't hired to come in and play like Antonio Conte style football. He was hired because they knew exactly what they were going to get with him. So it's not just as easy as us saying, right, well, the head coach should now change everything. Because it's not just the head coach. There's technical directors above them, sporting directors, owners. They want to play a certain way. And I don't think they're too far off. I think it would be worse to rip it up now and do something different.
Well, especially when you look at their next 4 fixtures. They've got Leicester at home. Then they obviously go to Manchester City, which is going to be difficult. And then they have Everton at home and the whipping boys of the whole Premier League, Wolves away. So, but obviously, Wolves will be looking at that fixture and thinking, right, we need to get our first win of the season. But we will know more about them after their next 4 games. So when people are talking about, we're in an international break, talking about Gary O'Neill perhaps, losing his job, or Russell Martin losing his job, hopefully the hierarchies at the football clubs will be thinking, hang on a minute, we've got some winnable games coming up a little bit further away for Wolves accepted, but for Southampton in particular.
And what would you rather have your coach implementing for those games? A style of play that's a little bit more possession heavy, a little bit more able to generate dangerous moments, than a team, as we've said, sitting deep and just going long and hoping for the best?
Quick word on Ipswich. They picked up 4 points, 4 draws. Obviously, they lost 4-1 prior to the international break against West Ham, which was a bit of a dent for them. But you wouldn't imagine that that's going to deter Kieran McKenna, because they seem to have shown that they've got a nice mix of blood and thunder and tactical nous.
Yeah, they look a bit more savvy to me. From the Liverpool game at the start of the season to what we saw against Villa in particular a couple of weeks ago, I noticed quite a big difference. I think they've had the best summer of recruitment of any of the promoted teams, probably. They've made some really good additions, some of whom haven't really been blooded yet. Sammy Szmodic we haven't seen much of, for example. But yeah, and obviously Delap has come in and scored 4, which is priceless to a team down there. I had a look this week at the top scorers for last season's relegated teams, and Burnley, Sheffield United was like 6. Luton was like 9, and he's already on 4. So if he's going to hit double figures and more, then that's going to be give them a really big chance of staying up.
There is actually more on the teams that haven't won in the Premier League so far, featuring you, Tim. You were speaking to Phil Hay and Ayo Akinwolere on Tuesday's edition of the podcast. So do tune in for that. I would have thought for the fans of those teams, it will feel like therapy, that they know that they're in the company of others. So
yeah, it felt like therapy for me. So yeah, maybe.
Good. Excellent. Above Ipswich sit Everton and Leicester. Leicester will have enjoyed their international break far more, because they picked up their first win of the season by beating Bournemouth 1-0. And I suppose you could argue that they were unlucky not to get something at the Emirates the week before. John, unlike the teams that we've spoken about that haven't won a game, do Leicester have maybe, less of a sort of clear identity, but one that's maybe a little bit more pragmatic? I suppose similar to Ipswich.
Yeah, whether or not, again, it comes down to whether or not we think that stands you in better stead to stay up. I'm not sure. I think the Bournemouth game that they picked up the 3 points, obviously that's quite a nice panacea for them. They sort of rode their luck a little bit there in that game. I think Bournemouth put up quite a few chances, and at the moment Bournemouth are way under their expected goals. So they're having a bit of a finishing problem. Turns out that if you sell Dom Solanke, it can make it harder to score. And yeah, more on that as we get it. But I think with Leicester, I think we will see more of that pragmatism. And again, do we think that Leicester or Southampton have different survival odds? I don't know. I think I expect to see both of them down there, and yeah, I as I say, I'm just agnostic on play style. I always just think the best thing to do is for a team and a coach to decide what they think is the best style of play, and you sort of go for it. A lot of the conversations we're having come down to the fact that these teams have a worse talent base than the teams above them, right? So you can utilise that talent base better or worse, but the reality is that for some of them, I think Ipswich are interesting in this respect, right? Because they've almost built a team that, should they go down, they'll be able to play the same sort of style with better players than they had last season in the championship, and hope to come back up again. And I suppose the argument for a team like Southampton might be, if we play a more expansive style, then when we go down, we're in pole position to actually come straight back up. And so what you do then is you treat that period of yo-yoing as a period to actually raise the talent level of your squad to a point where you actually can stay in the league eventually. So with these pragmatic teams, I'm always a little bit like, okay, let's say you play pragmatic the whole season, then you go down. Then what do? Do you just hope that these players who've been playing pragmatic football all season are suddenly going to, just by dint of the fact that they probably are a talent level higher than some of the teams in the division below, are they suddenly going to be able to immediately come back up? So I think these are all the questions that like clubs and directors of football and managers have to have at all times. And so it's very easy, I think, in a couple of games to be like, why don't you just change the way you're playing and then everything will be fine, because there's so many more considerations that come into it.
Yeah, that's the key thing, isn't it, really? However your team is playing, it will come down to the nerve of the hierarchy at that respective football club. Yeah. Will they hold their nerve and just stick to it, because those were the parameters that they laid out in front of the manager for that season. For Everton, they've managed to get it sort of back on track. Obviously lost those 2 games having led 2-0, but they've picked up points, beating Palace, drawing against Leicester and Newcastle. Sean Dyche deserves some credit, and I suppose it's more of a coincidence that it's been aligned with the news that they were going to get taken over by the Freakin Group, etc., etc. But it is clear that they needed a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel to just help the mood, and it seems to have manifested on the pitch as well.
I guess so. Yeah, for now, I think a better Newcastle team would have beaten them in their last game. Yeah, and then it'd be. Do you know? It's just like at certain clubs.
Anthony Gordon could have won that game, obviously, from the spot, and that big chance towards the end as well. Couldn't he?
Certain clubs just can't escape this weekly soap opera. United and Chelsea would be another one up, and there's always something going on. And Everton are just hectic. Like, the owners, I guess we'll see. That's yet to be sort of fully proven. We'll see what happens with that. The new stadium, they've always got an injury crisis going on. There's always something going on there. I bet Dyche must hate it,
but he'll be liking it a lot more now. I'm just pulling you out of your doom well. I was just giving you a sort of a positive thing to talk about with Everton.
No, there are positive things.
Or is it more highlighting fine margins than it could?
I mean, they've only won 1 game.
Yeah. Well, it takes a lot to win 1 game, as we've seen this season, haven't we, Tim?
God, you're on one today.
Certainly for Everton as well, who've had 2-0 leads in games and then ended up losing them too. It is tough. It's tough down there.
Yeah, but I like what they're doing with their attack in terms of McNeil being more central, and Jai looks good. Calvert-Lewin, they've got Doucouré as well. I think their team is better this year, and they're well equipped to stay up. But Everton being Everton, they're going to be there, aren't they?
Let's talk about a couple of other sides. Nottingham Forest and Brentford, who finished in 16th and 17th, respectively, last season. They currently sit 10th and 11th, respectively. Major talking point for Brentford, and really fun for everyone watching, I think. I've watched a couple of Match of the Days with my son, and sort of he's expecting them to score after a minute, and Obviously, we know that they have because Match of the Day is recorded. But, it happens and you're like, bloody hell, how are they doing it? Excuse me. Bloody hell, how are they doing it? And they continue to do it. I mean, it's great credit to Thomas Frank and all of his coaching team to be able to just start so fast and do it week in, week out.
Yeah, I mean, the quick starts are based around them turning kickoffs into set pieces, essentially. They lost their set piece coach, Bernardo Cueva, to Chelsea. And so a lot of people were saying that's a big edge getter for them. That gives them an advantage over a lot of the teams around them. Actually, their corner numbers have dropped off a little bit this season, but they've made up for it by treating these kickoffs as set pieces and having a plan in place so that they're able to get the ball into dangerous areas in the box quickly and destabilise the opposition as well. So, Brentford, I think a lot of people were quite worried about Brentford going into the season off the back of a number of different aspects of what was going on there. And one of the things I talk about a lot with Brentford is you take their starting midfielders in Vitaly Janelt, Christian Norgard and Matthias Jensen. That's a midfield that costs something like €7 million. That's an incredibly cheap midfield for a Premier League side to field pretty regularly over the course of their time in the Premier League and to still look functional. Brentford continue to do the things that Brentford do, which is overperform against all the odds. And it's nice to see them finding that edge again with, I think it's Keith Andrews now who's the set piece coach there. And Thomas Frank giving him his flowers in one of the post-match press conferences because everyone wanted to know how they were doing it. But really fascinating to see how they're doing it. I think that I've made a video being like, how sustainable is this? Because I think it's much harder to score from kickoffs than it is to score, for example, from corners. So I don't know how many times we're going to see them scoring those early goals in the beginning, I guess, first or second half. But it's got them into a really healthy position in the Premier League right now, and that's so important with respect to momentum. So it looks like they're probably going to be comfortable in the Premier League again.
Let's talk about Nottingham Forest. 4 out of 6 Athletic writers predicted Forest to be relegated at the start of the season. Were you in that? You didn't get the memo again on this.
Who were they?
I don't know who these 6 were.
It could have been me. I don't remember.
It could have been. But I guess from your perspective, with your your Wolves shirt on, which you always wear underneath whatever outer garment you're wearing, do you look enviously at that Forest side and see Nuno there and think, oh, Nuno's doing well there, isn't he?
Why do you keep changing my voice today?
He's doing well, isn't he? He's made inroads after a tricky first season.
Yeah, and that doesn't surprise me in theory because he can organise a team so well. He's done that throughout his career, but I think he's probably better equipped to work in a smaller club than a bigger club. His career would suggest that. Not so great at Porto and Spurs and Valencia. Whereas with the other 3, his first job in Rio Ave, he took them to Europe for the first time in their history in Portugal. He took Wolves into Europe for the first time in 40 years. And he's done very special things. And who knows? Forest are aiming for top 10, I think, this season is sort of the target. Their team
they are a crackers club, though, aren't they? So they are.
Yeah, but they've had a normal period of time.
Yeah.
Like the summer transfer window was not bonkers.
Maybe that's his normalising effect as well.
He's sort of been left to his own devices, allowed to bring in his own backroom team, which was something he didn't quite have at Spurs, which is really important with Nuno. So their team looks great. It looks really settled. Milenkovic has made a huge difference at the back. Him and Murillo as a back two is pretty solid. And then Ward-Prowse, I think, a great addition in midfield, and Hudson-Odoi on form with Gibbs-White. We'll see how bad his injury is going to be. But they've got the makings of a comfortable mid-table team this season.
And Chris Wood has stepped up when many people would have thought we need a new striker, and he's delivered. Right, let's look at the teams chasing Europe now. And Brighton and Spurs were involved in a crazy game last time out at the Amex. A game that I suppose, it showcased both the strengths and the weaknesses of both teams. But John, you were impressed with how Fabian Hürzeler used his front 4.
Yeah, I thought it was a really smart game plan up against Spurs, did the things that caused Spurs problems, and despite the fact that they went 2-0 down because of maybe a couple of defensive errors, they kept the game plan, made a couple of subs, and it carried on working. But
stick to your principles.
Stick to your principles. And I think I think Hurtzler and Ange Postecoglou, to be honest, are those kind of coaches, right? Where they're going to say, we're not against having a bit of a risky approach. And sometimes, like for Hurtzler, it's going to go wrong, like it did against Chelsea. Other times, it's going to go right, like it did against Spurs. And I think for a team like Brighton, that's the sort of trade-off they'll be happy to take. But it means that their games are highly entertaining to watch. I thought this was a really entertaining game. They've got some really fun players in. They brought some, each one of their goals was either created or scored by one of the starting front four, and I think all of those 4 players were involved in one of the goals. So yeah, it's a really exciting use of them. They were very aggressive in terms of like forcing Spurs back line back to create space in the middle, which Brighton could then build through and then have these sort of transitional moments where you sort of get the opposition back line worried about whether they need to step off or drop deep. And it was a good fun game, that one, wasn't it?
Well, we can get into whose fault it is, can't we, Tim? Whose fault is it? And do you have some sympathy for Ange?
I mean, Destiny Doggy would be high on my list because he was basically involved in all 3 goals and had a horrific second half performance. And maybe we can overanalyze these things, right? And just say, look, if they'd had a left back who was in form and could tackle or place himself in a good position defensively, then they might have won that game. However, what was really interesting, I listened to that podcast, and Jack made a point of something that Postecoglou had said after the game, which I'm amazed has not been really picked up on more, actually. And if it was someone like Ten Hag or Guardiola, it probably would have done. He was asked, because he didn't make any subs until they were sort of 3-2 down, and then he brought Sarr and Bissouma on to shore things up. It's kind of like we attempted to make earlier subs. He said, I could have done, but subs are irrelevant if you don't deserve to win. If you get something out of the game, you'll be falsely rewarded, he said. And I don't want to be falsely rewarded. So what he's basically saying is, it's up to you guys on the pitch to sort this out. I'm not going to, at 2-1 up, I'm not going to bring on 4 defenders and Mourinho my way to victory, because that's not what I want to do. Isn't that just an extreme example of sticking with your principles?
Yeah. But he is Mr. sticking with your principles.
Yeah, and
but he's also sitting 9th in the Premier League at the moment, way off the pace, which I guess in his own, and he's spoken about it himself, by his own standards, he will be saying, no, we should be competing with Liverpool and Manchester City. But they are, 8 and 7 points off them, respectively. Tottenham standards, yes, they had a good run, but they've got this performance in them. It's too high stakes, and he's stuck to his principles, and it's not working, is it?
It was quite maddening to watch them not take control of that game. And again, Jack mentioned on the podcast, which is something I've thought as well, that someone like Højbjerg would just, as a leader, as someone to get the group together, as someone to put his foot on the ball, as someone to win a free kick, just stop the madness. It was like 12, 14 minutes of madness. They haven't got players to stop that. What I would say, and maybe John's about to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, the underlying numbers are good for Spurs, which is the opposite of last season when they were sort of top of the league and everyone was saying they're going to regress to the mean. But if you look at, certainly their XG4 numbers are second in the league and XG against they're third in the league. So the numbers suggest that they will be better than 9th.
What? Okay. We'll see, won't we?
Yeah, with the underlying
because
numbers,
the overlying numbers are more important to fans.
And I agree that the way that they constantly seem to fall into these kind of problems is indicative. You can't just point to the numbers and say they're putting up a load of chances. The issue with Spurs is always going to be that almost the XG numbers lie a bit about them, because we've seen it in so many games now where all it takes is one moment for them to concede from like we can go through the games like the Leicester game. They transitioned backwards. All the players ended up out of position. Jamie Vardy ends up having a free header, much easier to score. The Newcastle game is a couple of scenarios where they failed to defend inadequately. The second one, Maddison jumps up in a really aggressive way and then misses the tackle on Joel Linton, and Joel Linton has a fairly easy pass through to runners in the centre of the pitch. The problem with Spurs is that yes, they're going to be putting up a ton of numbers, but they have to be so consistent constantly with their out of possession approach, that if they aren't, then they're getting punished for it. So yeah, they're putting up better underlying numbers than Arsenal so far. They're higher on the table than Arsenal on the expected points models as well. But I do think there's a tactical explanation for why that is the case and why Spurs fans shouldn't just be falling back onto that.
Hold up a
defense.
They're in the expected points tables. They're higher than Arsenal.
Yeah.
So whoever puts this together thinks that Tottenham, based on the numbers currently,
Who are you putting down to one person's?
Yes, it's one person.
Whoever this squad is, he or she, they think that Tottenham will achieve a higher points level.
The expected points table basically takes the underlying numbers from the games that have happened, and on the basis of that works out the amount of points you would expect them to have won from those games if they'd have played over an infinite amount of games, right? So what they're saying is that Spurs have put up more and better chances than most of their opponents, to the extent that you would have expected them to have won more than they have so far. But like the Leicester game's a good example of that, right? It's a game where they controlled the game for a long period, but then had that one moment where they gave up the goal, and that changed the game state, and everything sort of followed from that. So yeah, for me, I don't think the Spurs fans should be just falling back and being like, well, we've got really good underlying numbers, because the problem here, I think, is maybe more tactical than it is, a sort of, we've just been a little bit unlucky to have not come out on top in some of these games. That's the scenario that they're in. They're creating a lot of, I guess, chances. They're not finishing them, and then they're losing control in games quite a bit as well. It's because they're quite aggressive out of possession, right? So you can see, if you look at their pressing numbers through games, that they tend to tail off in second halves. And how many games have we seen where they've been on top for the first 60 minutes, and then that's when the problems come in. So I think there's definitely more to it than just the underlying numbers are good, although I do think that it is an interesting aspect of it.
Well, the long and short of it is that Tottenham and Ange Postecoglou will be expecting to finish higher than they did last season, which was 5th. They're currently in 9th, so they've got work to do. In between Brighton in 6th and Tottenham in 9th are Newcastle and Fulham. Newcastle, they're just 2 points off the top 4. When you look at their just sort of basic numbers, and which is sort of my level, they've scored 8 and they've conceded 7. They've achieved 12 points and they sit 7th. I mean, that's good work so far from Eddie Howe, when it wasn't necessarily looking as if it was going to be an easy season for Newcastle. There was lots of rumblings of things going on, but they're about where they should be.
I'd say they're overperforming.
Okay.
I think their underlying numbers have dropped off. All of their numbers have dropped off considerably. So I'd say at the moment they're sort of performing as a mid-level team. So to be 2 points off the top 4 is incredible for them. But they've had a few things go their way. There was the Bournemouth disallowed goal, for example. I guess Everton had that penalty turned down, which looked to most people like a penalty.
Yeah, it wasn't though, was it?
Like it was. It was.
I don't think it was.
Yeah, it was a penalty.
I don't think it was.
Well, there we go. What do you think, Tim?
Which one was that? Sorry, I was just
Dan Burn. When Dan Burn just sort of.
No, it's not a penalty. No,
it's not a pen, is it?
I've lost this battle.
That was like the VAR room, wasn't it? That was it. That's how they work it out. It was. It wasn't. It was. It was.
But then this the game against Spurs. We've been talking about where Spurs largely dominated the game, but Newcastle took their chances. So I think that the results they've had are maybe a little bit flattering for them, and I think it's a bit worrying, because they had that vertiginous rise, and now it's starting to look like a vertiginous fall.
Yeah, Fulham, vertiginous. That's direction of that's.
It's like vertigo, isn't it?
Yeah,
so I guess inducing vertigo, so you're going up really quickly.
Up and vertiginous.
Up and down.
Excellent. Fulham, word about them. Raul Jimenez, doing brilliant things, and Fulham as a whole they're doing as you expected, aren't they, Tim? You've always fancied them this season.
I've enjoyed watching them for a few years now under Marco Silva, and I thought they had a great summer in terms of bringing in Anderson, as we said, from Palace. I still can't believe that was sort of allowed to happen, really. That Palace sell to a rival for not obscene money, and then Smith Rowe as well, and Reece Nelson. I think they've made some really savvy additions. But also 2 players who were on the bench last season in Traore and Jimenez, enjoyed success at Wolves in the past together, come to the forefront this season. And yeah, it's great to see Jimenez looking something like his old self, which, to be honest, I didn't think would happen. He's 33 now. He's not getting any younger, and he's sort of back to sort of his 1-in-2 ratio, which he was achieving at Wolves. in the past few months. So yeah, physically he seems to have got his touch and his rhythm back, and mentally he's got his
assist at Man City. We need to talk about that, don't we?
Yeah, assist of the season, I think.
Yeah. You're not going to like that, are you?
No, I thought it was. I thought it was incredible.
I just meant the concept of an assist of the season. It feels like the sort of thing that you would rail against.
No, I think we should have more of that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think that's. I think it's got all the makings of assist of the season, that, hasn't it? It has.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Right. Let's talk about 3 teams who have 8 points. Doesn't sound like the most interesting thing to talk about, but there is some elements of this which are particularly interesting. West Ham, first and foremost, in 12th, and they've got the uplift that they needed, especially before this international break. Julian Lopetegui was expected to have a big impact. I suppose it's difficult to judge whether he's had that impact yet simply by the fact that they beat Ipswich 4-1. But will he be feeling more optimistic now?
Well, yeah, certainly than he was before that 4-1 win. Some of the worst games I've seen this season played by West Ham. The game against Chelsea was, I think, possibly the worst out-of-possession performance I've seen from a Premier League side in 5 years. It was absolutely awful, culminating with Guido Rodriguez getting hooked.
Why did you only get back 5 years then?
Well,
is there one that you remember 6 years ago that was particularly worse?
No, it's just that I feel as though before 5 years my reading of games was probably a lot more shaky than it is
Fair
now.
enough.
So, I wasn't quite so
bothered by the underlying numbers,
out of possession football at that point. But it's still a work in progress. We can't say off the back of a result against a promoted side that they're back, but they do have one of the best top forward lineups, I suppose, attacking lineups out of anyone outside the big 6 quite comfortably. So for them to be in 12th place, I think is still massive underperformance from where they should be. But yeah, maybe this is the turning point. That's what we always look for in the media, isn't it? It's just the moment that changes their season. Winning 4-1 shows that you can do it with the players you have, even if maybe it wasn't the most convincing performance. So yeah, I guess it's the step in the right direction from West Ham.
And Bournemouth just tucked in behind them.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously disappointed not to get anything from their visit to Leicester, and now they've got Arsenal, Villa and City in their next 3 games. It's a big test, but your friend Iraola will love that challenge, won't he?
Yeah, I have heard him say in press conferences that they've been really good at teams outside the top 3, but they've never really managed to crack the top 3. So Liverpool, City, and Arsenal. So 2 of those teams in the next 3 games suggest that we shouldn't be too hopeful that Bournemouth will get results. It'll be interesting to see what they do with Villa. The thing about Bournemouth is I think they just make games chaotic, and I think so many Premier League sides want to make games controlled and make sure they have the ball and know where they're at, and they're able to produce a good structure on the field by passing it around. And what Bournemouth do is they're like, we're not going to do none of that. We're just going to go really quick. We're going to destabilise you, and we're going to be better set up to be able to benefit from those sorts of game states.
More teams should be like Bournemouth, shouldn't they?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly like a different approach, and I think it's quite refreshing. It means that you watch games against, for example, the Leicester game's a great example of that, right? Bournemouth should be beating Leicester more often than not, and probably, I mean, you could argue the toss and whether or not they deserve to, but in those games, going into them, as someone who watches all of Bournemouth's games, those are the games where I'm like, this is the one that I expect there to be trouble for Bournemouth. They're really good at those mid-table sides, so anyone below the top 3, as we said, and anyone above, like a team that's just going to sit in and the team like Leicester are pretty well set up to deal with chaotic situations themselves, right? So what happens then is there's a bit more of a levelling. It's kind of like, well, who's going to finish better? And at the moment, Bournemouth's finishing hasn't been great, and so those games can be troublesome. But against a team like Manchester United at the moment, I'd be like, yeah, Bournemouth will cause them a lot of issues. So it's definitely a play style thing, which maybe it sort of changes the dynamic of some of the games. You would expect them to struggle with teams higher up the table and be better against teams lower down the table, but it's absolutely the opposite way around, I think, with Bournemouth. So, but it is fun to watch something a little bit different from a team like that.
Manchester United are 14th. Their worst start to a Premier League season.
Since last season.
Their worst start since last season?
Yeah.
Last season was their joint worst ever start.
And now they've gone past it. Yeah.
We have covered them a lot over the last couple of weeks, Tim, and you have got your teeth into them, but they are sitting 5 points above the relegation zone. They've scored 5 goals, conceded 8. Is there anything more that you can add to a difficult period for them? Maybe some signs of optimism after their draw at Aston Villa.
Yeah, it's actually only their worst start since last season, when they're the joint worst start of the season, which is interesting, I thought. But yeah, no, I was impressed with them against Villa, purely because they enlisted a tactical plan and the players stuck to it, and they came for a 0-0, I think, probably fair enough to say, and they got it. It's not often you can say that with Man United. After a horrendous week defensively against Spurs and Porto.
That's not the trough that they should be eating from,
no, it's
is
not.
it?
It's not, but that's where they're at right now, And they came in for quite a bit of stick for not creating any chances at the other end. But I was like, let's give Ten Hag a break for 1 week. And look, he managed to get this right. But of course, that's not a blueprint going forward in the long term. Man United can't do that every week. So yeah, I see no future for him.
I'm sorry. Very good. Well done. You tried your best, didn't you? No, but I completely agree with you, and I think that it's very laudable, as we've said in the past, that they have shown faith. But just sometimes it just doesn't feel right, doesn't smell right, doesn't look right, and that's okay. Have you enjoyed that review of 7 games?
I'd like to leave the studio now, please.
Yes, that's not a problem. Let's not forget all of the podcasts that you can hear via the Athletic FC, the likes of the Tactics Pod. You got your briefing as well. You got your weekday hits of this Athletic FC podcast, one of which features Tim earlier on in the week talking about teams who are yet to win. But I hope you feel we have won in this review of the season so far after 7 games. Thanks to Tim. Thanks to John. Thanks very much for listening. We'll be back on Monday. Have a wonderful weekend.
If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search the Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.